Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and I'm honored to announce that Cowboy Crossroads has been nominated for the Best of Western Horseman Awards by Western Horseman Magazine under the People/Western Media category. If you're inclined to vote, I'd sure appreciate the support. You can cast a vote every day between now and July 1st. Just visit whmag.co/vote-now. That's whmag.co/vote-now. I'd like to start today's show with a poem by S. Omer Barker. This is from Barker's 1968 book, Rawhide Rhymes, and it's entitled Pants Polisher. They asked me, "What's a saddle?" So I told them it's a cack, a rig of wood and leather shaped to fit a horse's back. You sat up in its middle with a leg hung down each side, some horse meat in between them, and that is known as ride. I could have stopped right there, of course, and saved a heap of steam, but when they speak of saddles, my old eyes take on a gleam. For the saddle is an implement that's bred a breed of man who rides the range of history plumb back to Genghis Khan. 2 legs was all us humans had, but men that wanted more, they figured out the saddle, and its magic gave 'em 4. The Saracen, the Cossack, the Arab and the Knight, the Mongol and the Chevalier, they all was men of might, because instead of walking like a tamer breed would do, they climbed up in a saddle when they had a job in view. King Richard was a saddle man, and Sheridan and Lee and Grant and Blackjack Pershing, just to mention 2 or 3. Remember old Sir Galahad of that there poet's tale? His pants was saddle polished while he sought the Holy Grail. Of course them heroes never rode no Texas apple horn, but they're the cowboys' kinfolks just as sure as you were born. They asked me, "What's a saddle?" It's a rigging made to fit a man, sometimes a woman, in the region where they sit. It's made of wood and leather with a cinch that goes around a chunk of living horse meat twixt the rider and the ground. It's just the apparatus that a cowhand climbs upon to start his day of cow work at the chilly hour of dawn. It's just a piece of riding gear that, when it's had a chance, has give the world some heroes while it polished up their pants. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is J.B. Zielke. J.B. Zielke is a cowboy, author, and videographer. He's the man behind the Dusty Vaquero music video series and his book, The Lost Cowboy, about cowboying on 6 continents, was the winner of the Spur Award from the Western Writers of America in 2024. I sat down with JB in Steamboat Springs, Colorado during the Music Fest and recorded this interview. Here's JB Zielke.
My family doesn't own any livestock. My parents have never worked in agriculture in any way, or my grandparents or anything like that. And so when I was 7 years old, we lived in Estes Park, Colorado, and we had moved around a little bit when I was younger. And in Estes Park, my mom worked at the grocery store, and at that time, that wasn't a very big town, and that was the only grocery store. So she knew everybody that lived in that town. And there was a lady that would come in all the time and tell my mom, she'd say, "You ought to bring your boys out and have them get on my horses. If they've never been on one, they'd probably like it." And so after months of her offering that, finally there was a day where my mom had time to take us out there. And I've got two younger brothers, and at the time, the youngest brother, he probably wasn't old enough to get on. He would have been very young, but my middle brother, he didn't really care for it much, but the second I swung up on a horse at 7, I was just hooked on it. And so I would ride my bike out there and work for this lady for free and do whatever I could do to go out there and be around horses, be around livestock, and learn as much as I possibly could. And my parents both worked a lot growing up, so they weren't. If I was lucky, they'd pick me up and take me home from the ranch, but usually it was on me to ride my bike there to get there in the first place. And I would make, some days I'd make $5-10, something like that, as a 7, 8, 9-year-old, and I'd save that money. And by the time I was 12, I went to a kill pin auction, and I bought a horse for $500. He was probably 30. He was ancient, but that was my first time owning a horse of my own. And I had that horse, and I would try and use him to do a little bit of day work where I could to maybe make enough to pay for his hay. And that was my first kind of jump into it. There was an old ranch across town called the McGregor Ranch, and it's still there, and it's a really cool historic ranch. I don't know if it still runs cattle, but when I was a kid, we would drive cattle right through the middle of town. It was the police would stop traffic, and there'd be thousands of people. It was like a unofficial parade, and we'd take all these cows up to summer pasture, but you'd have to go right through downtown Estes Park, which can be crazy and very busy. So I guess that was kind of my start into it, but it's certainly not a family ordeal. It was something that I just loved from a very young age, and I was fortunate enough to find that kind of by accident. Another way that I saw of being part of the Western world at a young age was working for the rodeo and entering rodeos. So I worked for free for the rooftop rodeo up there in Estes, and then I'd get on sheep at first, and then I got on steers, and by the time I was, I guess, probably 14, I started getting on full-size bulls. I guess when I was 15 or 16, we moved to Wisconsin, and a lot of that Western culture was gone there. It just didn't exist. And so I still went to high school rodeos when I was there, but they were much further away and harder to find. And so I was riding bulls all through high school, and I always really wanted to go to the University of Wyoming, because when I was a young kid, I ran into, I'd see a lot of people wearing Wyoming Cowboys gear, sweatshirts or hats, whatever. And I asked somebody, I said, what's Wyoming Cowboys? And they said, well, it's a college, and that's just what they are. They're cowboys. And as a kid, my understanding was that was a college you went to learn how to be a cowboy. So for years, I thought that I was going to go there so I could be a better cowboy. And obviously, once I got a little older, I realized that's not what it was. But I'd always wanted to go there. So when I was high school rodeoing, I started sending off these tapes of me riding bulls to different rodeo programs. And I had interest from Oklahoma State and South Dakota State and several other schools. But when George Howard, the rodeo coach there, he said, if you come out here, we could probably find some money to put you on scholarship and everything. So I decided to go to the University of Wyoming, and I rodeoed through most of the way through college, and I had a real bad wreck in Casper, and I got kicked in the back of the head by a bull, and I don't remember any of it, but I was completely out in the arena, and they say that my breathing had stopped, and they were pretty worried about me, and I was out, and a photographer actually sent me pictures of what had happened afterwards, and it was pretty crazy. You could see all my friends kneeling over top of me in that arena, and them putting me on a backboard and hauling me out in an ambulance. And I didn't stop riding bulls after that, but it was never the same. I never showed up to win when I was there. It kind of killed my confidence, and so I continued to ride bulls, but it slowly petered out, and I decided I probably should move on to something different. And rodeo left a huge void in my life, and I was just searching for something to fill that. And that's when international travel came into play. There was a gal from Australia She was doing a study abroad program at the University of Wyoming, and I asked her, I said, could you get me work over there? I had seen these YouTube videos of guys catching feral bulls out in the middle of nowhere. She said, all of you Americans ask that, and you never go. When I line it up and then you don't go. I said, I promise. And it was pure luck that her brother happened to own a crew that's all they did was catch wild bulls. So I pestered her enough that she finally put me in contact with him, and I flew over there to Australia to catch feral bulls in the middle of nowhere. So all through college, I call him my grandpa. He's not blood to me in any way, but I worked and lived on his ranch, which is around Saratoga, Wyoming, south central Wyoming. So it was about 2 hours from where I was going to college. So I would, all summer long, I'd work for him, and then while I was in college, I'd come back for big events, our bull sale and branding and things like that. So I was working on the same outfit, big cow-calf operation in south central Wyoming the whole time I was in college. Every free moment I had was spent on that ranch. And when I went to Australia, I had 1 semester left of college. So it was just barely overlapped with college that I started traveling. Yeah, so the rodeo riding bulls obviously was a huge adrenaline rush. And so that void that was left in my life, travel perfectly filled that, because it was also an adrenaline rush. It wasn't quite so abrupt like bull riding was, but it was more sustained. And when I went to Australia, I don't know that I'd ever seen the ocean before. We didn't have much money when I was growing up, so we didn't do a lot of traveling and seeing a lot of things. So at that time, I'm going to Australia. I was 21 years old, and it was my first time out of the country. It was my first time seeing different cultures, all of those things. And so I hopped on a plane, and I I ended up having like an emergency surgery about a week or two before I went to Australia. And so with that surgery, it was on my lower back, and communication with the owner over there had been terrible. He was using a satellite phone in the middle of nowhere. And so I would send all these questions saying, what should I bring? What type of work will I be doing? Where, all these different questions. And he answered none of them. So I just showed up with a bag full of clothes, hoping that I was in the right place. And I flew into Australia, into Cairns, and then I had to take a mail plane, which was a little 6-seater that it hauled people and animals and fresh produce and everything. It was like a school bus doing a round out there in the middle of nowhere in northern Queensland. They dropped me off this plane, and the pilots, the guys who were on the plane with me were just, they almost looked terrified for me, seeing an American at my age going out to where I was going. And they just said, good luck, mate. And they threw my bags out on this dirt airstrip and took off and left me there. And the guys that were supposed to be picking me up weren't there. It was just a dirt airstrip in the middle of nowhere. And there was one old Aboriginal man there that he had a little tractor that he used to refuel planes when they need it. And I asked him, that was my first time hearing an Aboriginal accent, which is considerably harder to understand than just your regular old Australian accent. And I asked this guy if he knew the guy I was supposed to be working for. He said, no, mate, never heard of him, and just disappeared into the bush. And so I sat there on my bags for about 2 hours before these two of the roughest looking Aussies I've ever seen pull up in a flatbed Toyota and picked me up. And I had never been so relieved in my life. And we went out there to camp, and I slept in a bedroll for 4 months. I slept inside one night the entire time I was in Australia. And those guys just had me set up out there, and it was kind of like they were kind of apocalyptic-looking cowboys. Like, they had all these Mad Max-looking rigs for catching bulls, and everybody sleeping on the ground. And we set our camp up around just an old tin shed and in the middle of nowhere. And that shed was just the perfect habitat for one or many of the hundreds of very deadly snakes in Australia. So we would deal with snakes that could kill you almost on a daily basis. They were They were in the shower. They were in the cook tent. They were just everywhere. So you constantly had to be watching where you were stepping. But that was my first day in Australia that I got out there, and we went and started catching these feral bulls that the company I worked for was contracted. I believe it was through the bank actually that they were contracted, because it was Aboriginal land that we were working on, and we had other contracts on the stations that were neighboring us, and those were privately owned, pretty well run stations. But altogether, those 3 stations I think totaled something like 6 million acres. But that Aboriginal place that we worked on, it had been given back to them 60 years ago, 70 years ago, something like that. And it was a fully functioning cattle station at that point. And they didn't want to use it as a profitable cattle station. That wasn't what they cared about or wanted. So that place basically reverted back to nature over the following 70 years. All the fences fell down. The cattle reverted back to being 50% bulls, 50% cows, because they didn't pull anything off. They didn't castrate. They didn't brand. It was just cattle being turned back to nature for 10, 15 generations. And so they ended up being in some financial trouble. And the bank said, well, why don't you go out there and catch some of these bulls? They're worth money, and start selling them to the meat packer. And you can catch all these bulls. You can make a little money off them, turn out some good Brahman bulls instead of just all this inbred stuff. And then you can kind of start working this back to not necessarily a full-blown cattle station, but you can make some money off these cattle. They're there. They're eating your grass. You might as well use them. And so that was why we were there. It was in that particular part of the company, we just caught bulls all day, every day. And we'd go out looking for them and knock them down or tail them down and tie them up. And we'd bring them back to the yards that we had kind of cobbled together, because they had fallen in on themselves. They were old, just pole fence, pole corrals that over time had crumbled. So all we had to fix that was just baling wire, and we'd just use as much as possible to tie everything together. And we'd catch these bulls. We would tail them down on a dirt bike, or you'd kind of spin them out with a 4-wheeler or a bull catcher, and we'd tie them up, put them in a 6-wheel drive army truck, and then bring them back to the corrals. And as they walked off the truck, we'd stick a brand on them, cut the tips of their horns off so that they didn't fight and gut each other in that corral. And then once we had about 150 to 200 bulls in that corral, we would call a road train. So the road train would show up, and that was a great big long rig. It was probably equivalent to 3 or 4 American cattle pots, but all one rig pulling them. And so they'd pull in, and we'd spend an entire day loading 150, 200 bulls on this truck. And he'd take off and drive them 10 hours down to the sale barn, and then ultimately to the meat packer down there. And that's just for months. That's what we did. We just kept catching bulls and tying them up and putting them on trucks and getting them out of there. And then we'd release the occasional Brahman, purebred white Brahman bull back into this herd. All the cows that we caught, we'd brand them and kick them back out. If we got yearlings in there or anything, same thing. They'd go to the sale barn and probably end up in a feedlot in another part of Australia. But it was essentially just cleaning up a range that hadn't been touched in 70 years. I was in Australia for 4 months, because I would have stayed longer, but I had 1 semester of college left, and I knew if I didn't go back, I never would, because I was just having so much fun. So I ended up going back to the States, and I finished up. I double majored in ag business and veterinary science, or a pre-vet is what that was. And I just never really ended up having a use for those degrees. I'm glad I got them, but I never used them. And right as I graduated, somebody who had their master's degree in veterinary science told me that they were having trouble finding a job because they weren't bilingual. And I thought, well, that's a problem, because I've never taken a Spanish class in my life, and I know very little. and that now at this point I'm done with college. The only way to learn it is to immerse myself. And so I got to thinking maybe where can I go work as a cowboy, because that was really the only skill set that I had at that time. And I thought, where can I find work doing that, where they speak Spanish, so I can work and learn at the same time. And I looked at Mexico, and it seemed at that time too dangerous to be going down there and working. And then I really wanted to go to Brazil, but I didn't see a whole lot of value of being fluent in Portuguese, because that's all they speak in Brazil. And so then I looked at Argentina, and in Argentina they speak Spanish. There's lots of ranches and everything. So I decided, as soon as I graduated college, I took off and went down to Argentina for a couple months and just lived with gauchos and learned as I went.
I want to hear more about that. I'm curious, when you were in Australia, did you ever encounter any of the bush poetry? Did those guys do any of that stuff, or sing those old songs, or was that a part of the culture still? Yeah.
Some of it, especially the Aboriginal folks, it was kind of unfortunate. Aborigines were treated pretty poorly down there for a long time, and still, this was 10 years ago, but there was definitely some discrimination, and a lot of their stories, and I guess it was kind of poetry. It had like kind of a rhythm, and it was almost like chants that they would do. But the unfortunate part was those Aboriginal cultures, they all had their own, they just called them their own tongue. But there were small tribes, I guess, and so they all had pretty distinct individual tongues. And really only the elders spoke them when I was over there. It was a dying language that very few young people found value in learning. So they all had switched to English, but the elders had plenty of, songs and chants and these old stories that they would pass down to the younger generations. And there was some kind of odd ones that I, hadn't expected. There was these myths of kind of monsters that lived out there in the middle of nowhere where we were. There was one called Featherfoot, and Featherfoot was like essentially the Aboriginal Grim Reaper. And when he would visit you, if you came home or woke up to a feather on your pillow, that meant you were going to die. And they took that very seriously down there. And some people thought it was funny to use that as a joke. Some of the, not on our crew, but a different crew, I heard one of the guys had a little bit too much to drink and went and put some feathers on the Aboriginal guys' pillows that were working with them, at just trying to be funny. And when they woke up the next morning to go to work, they were the whole Aboriginal crew was gone, and they were shorthanded, and they had silently left in the night, and because they thought they were going to die. And so they went home to see their families and everything, and it wasn't really a funny joke, and when they got to thinking about it. But they took that stuff seriously. You always stepped off your horse and walked by graves. Well, there was a lot of graves out there that we'd see while we were working, and you'd step off and you never rode past a grave. You just walked past the grave. And those Aboriginal guys that I worked with, they would talk with their ancestors. And you, once somebody dies in their culture, you never speak their name again. You just refer to them as my grandpa, my cousin, something like that, but their name is never spoken again out of respect, I guess, for them. But they would talk to them. So we'd walk past these graves, and it was always a little bit eerie, but it was always cool to listen to these guys talk to their family members who were in the ground right there as we were walking by. And they would have dreams of, they would say, I don't know what this means, but I dreamt this last night, and we need to stay away from the river or something like that. And generally it was true. We would come to a river, and the next day, and somebody would have a story about how they got way too close to a crocodile that they didn't see or something like that. So these guys it was very cool to see how connected they were with the land and everything they did. But part of it was certainly songs and stories and poetry that they had passed along. I couldn't understand it because it was in their native tongue. Yeah, so going to Argentina was Australia was certainly a culture shock, but I didn't have to deal with the language barrier. Going to Argentina was a whole nother level because my Spanish was almost non-existent, and there wasn't that many people down there that spoke English. So I got thrown into that country, and I was just thrown to the wolves and had to learn on the fly as I was going. And I ended up, the first gig I lined up down there was for kind of a dude operation. And I was okay with that, but my understanding was that I would be horseback every day helping these gauchos bring the horses in, and we would be taking people on rides, but it was also a functioning cattle ranch, so I thought I'd be mostly doing that. And what ended up happening was there was a lot more required of me in the kitchen and setting the dining table and things like that, which there's nothing wrong with that, but I wasn't there to learn how to properly set a 7-course meal, and didn't really care to know about that. I really wanted to be out there horseback all the time, so I'd spend half my day horseback and then half my day doing odd jobs kind of around the kitchen and headquarters. And after about a month of that, I went to the owner and I said, look, I'm not trying to put you out here, and I'm not quitting on you, but if you can find a replacement, I would really like to go work somewhere that I could just be working horseback, working with cattle all the time. And that really upset him. I thought I was doing the right thing by saying, I'll stay as long as you need me, just you might start looking for somebody else. And he said, if you feel that way, you best just leave today. And so he kicked me off that place. But luckily I had lined up some work ahead of time, and I ended up going to a different part of Argentina and working for a veterinarian that he traveled around and worked on different places, but he also had a big ranch of his own. So he had me work on his place with the guys that worked for him, and that was my first time really meeting somebody, an adult, that couldn't read or write. And maybe I met some of them in Australia and I just didn't know, but it was like day number 2 on this place that the cow boss, he had all of his sons working for him also, and the cow boss he was 4th generation on that place. And so he'd grown up in a mud hut on that estancia, and so did his dad and his dad before, and so he never learned to read or write. He hardly ever went to town. And so when we were vaccinating a bunch of yearlings and branding them, and he couldn't read the bottle, and I didn't know why. I thought maybe his eyes were bad, and he had to ask his son to come over and read to him the dosage that he was supposed to be giving these cattle. And it wasn't until later that I realized it was just because he couldn't read or write. But his son, who was probably 10 or 12, had a 4th grade education. And that was a big deal in a place like that to have a 4th grade education. So his son would read and write everything his dad needed for him. And they'd be up at 4 every morning saddling horses. And these guys owned nothing. They would go everywhere horseback. And if they owned one good horse, that was all they needed. And they'd live on the far reaches of this ranch, and they'd get up at 3:30 or 4, ride their horses over to the headquarters where I was staying, and then we'd run in a bigger bunch of horses and rope out our horses for the day and saddle up and go gather or go preg check or whatever we were going to do that day. And I learned a bunch from those guys, both about their language, but also the way that they do things. It was a very, very different way of horsemanship. It was a different way of speaking, but generally the cattle stuff was it was similar to what I was used to. It was just hot weather ranching rather than cold. So we'd deal with bot flies and a bunch of kind of weird tropical cattle diseases that I had never seen before, because Australia was hot, but it was kind of deserty almost, so we didn't deal with the humidity and bugs so much. But in Argentina it was pretty rough, the bugs. So that place taught me a bunch. They made me a saddle. Those most outfits, they keep extra saddles and stuff around, and that wasn't the case for these guys, because they just didn't have the means to own a bunch of extra tack. So they had one for themselves, and that was it. So the boss gave me a piece of a saddle and told the hands to to make the rest of it. And so we had Argentinian saddles have no tree, no structure to them. And so it's essentially just a piece of leather. The front of it has a long roll on the front, kind of like a buck and roll on a wade tree saddle. And so it was just packed full of wool or straw or something like that. Front and back, there would be one of those rolls to keep you from sliding off. There was no D-rings on the saddle. So when he gave me that piece of leather, the guys I worked with, they said, okay, we'll go make a saddle. So one of them disappears, and they all carried these big 10, 12-inch long knives, and he went out and he found an old couch that had been burned out, but there was one piece that wasn't burned, and he cut out the styrofoam from one of the cushions, and that was my saddle pad. And then another guy was looking around, and there wasn't enough latigos and cinches to go around, so they put the pad on, and then they put the piece that boss had given me on there, and then he just went and found a ratchet strap like you'd use to secure a load on a pickup, and he ratchet strapped that onto the horse. And then I didn't have, they had an old rusty bit that this guy was grinding on a rock trying to get all the rust off of it, but there was no head stall, no reins or anything like that. So same guy who had cut up the couch, he disappears and comes back with about 12 foot of extension cord. And he starts cutting pieces of extension cord, and he braided out of the wire that was in the extension cord. He just very quickly braided me a head stall for that bit, and then braided me a set of reins out of extension cord. And that was the rig that I rode the whole time that I was at that particular place in Argentina. I was in Argentina about 3 or 4 months also. I intended to be there a lot longer, and I had a visa that would have let me stay for pretty much as long as I wanted. But working at that particular ranch, there was a bunch of swampy country right there, and we're pushing cows, and there's capybaras coming up out of the swamp and running around. It was a very unique kind of climate, but there's a lot of mosquitoes and stuff in that swamp also, and the place I was sleeping in was just kind of a adobe kind of brick building, but there was no windows in that building, and I didn't have a mosquito net, and so all I would do is I would just put a fan on myself when I went to sleep, hoping that would blow away the mosquitoes if they tried to land on me. But I eventually got really sick, and I didn't know why, but to get to that particular operation, I had rode on the fender of a tractor for 2 hours from the paved road into headquarters. So we were way out in the middle of nowhere, and I got to feeling really sick. I hadn't eaten in days, and I was shaking, and I was really pale, and I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what, and I didn't want to be stuck there with something wrong. So I ended up coming back to the U.S. much sooner than I had anticipated, and they did a bunch of tests, and basically they found out my liver was failing. I had stage 1 liver failure at 22 years old, and they said this just doesn't make sense. So they started doing all these tests and everything, and they ruled out all the easy things. And they told me, they said, we don't have the test for it here, but we're pretty sure you got the Zika virus from mosquitoes while you were living down there. And Zika, around that time, was the Rio Olympics as well, and they had been warning people not to go down, pregnant women specifically, because the Zika virus was so rampant down there in Brazil and Argentina at that time. So they figured that I got Zika, and it attacked my liver, and so I had to just take it easy for a while, and I'm fine now, but it took a while for my body to recover from that.
In the foreword to J.B. Zielke's book, The Lost Cowboy, his friend and musician Colter Wall wrote these words. As cattlemen, we dream of what life was like on a trail crew driving herds north with no fences in sight. Places where technology fades away and the spirit of the wild is still keen. Something has driven J.B. to travel to where the modern world has just begun to meet the untamed land. In this book, he records what those worlds are like while they still exist.
So when I got back, now I was fresh back into the U.S. with these 2 degrees that I thought I should be using. So my mind kind of shifted to thinking maybe I need to pursue a career, whether I want to be working in a feedlot or becoming a ranch manager or something, but moving up the ladder, so to say. And I worked for an outfit in Oklahoma for a little while, and I really didn't enjoy that very much, so I came back to Wyoming, and I started working for a young guy there that was he was building his own, cattle empire, or trying to. And I worked for him for a while, and I learned a ton from him. And I thought, well, if he's doing it, I'm going to try and do it too. So I started buying my own livestock, and I sold my diesel pickup, horse trailer, pretty much everything I had, and I bought a $600 old Buick Skylark from somebody in town that barely ran. The exhaust dragged on the ground, but it would get me to town to get groceries. And I had bought a bunch of these goats, and I was going to go clear out brush for people, and it worked for a while, and then there was some unforeseen circumstances where I had to get rid of those goats, and I had only a couple days to get rid of them. And because of that, I didn't have a chance to market them properly, and I ended up having to just sell them at the sale barn, and I sold them for half what I bought them for. And I had a trucking and pasture and everything else into these goats, and I essentially lost everything. So I had my 15-year-old brother living with me and 2 dogs, and lost everything. And so all I had left was this $600 Buick, and we lived out of that Buick. We would just go out on BLM ground and camp wherever people wouldn't bother us. And we were just kind of homeless, drifting around, day working here and there for a whole summer. And my brother had the greatest time. He went back to school that fall, and his teachers asked how his summer went, and he went and told them that he had the greatest summer ever because all we did was go camping. But he had no idea we were just homeless, living out of a car. So it was around that time that I was feeling pretty down on myself and what was going on. And my little brother told me, he said, well, if you think about it, you've worked as a cowboy now on 3 out of the 6 continents. And up until then, that had not occurred to me. And he said, so if you are able, you might as well go for the other 3 that have livestock on them. And that was the first time that it became a goal of mine to go to these other, finish it out and go through the other 3 continents. So I had taken a course called Ranching for Profit. I've taken it twice, and it's like a week-long crash course, business course that helps ranchers. And in that course, there was a gal from Sweden, and she had never seen sheep or goat operation. And when I was taking the course, I had both, and so she came out and spent a day or 2 seeing how that all worked. And she said, if you ever want, you're welcome to come over to my family's place in Sweden and work for us and check it out. And so it was about a year later that I just out of the blue contacted her, and I said, hey, how hard would it be for me to come over there? And she said, come whenever you want. So I bought a plane ticket that day and flew to Sweden, and I spent 3 months over there in Sweden working for, I believe it was the biggest cattle operation in Northern Europe at that time. They had a long-term lease on a military base there because there's a cap on how much land you can privately own in Sweden and some of those other Scandinavian countries. So it's impossible to privately own enough land to run a big operation. They were an exception because they had that huge military base leased, and it was a panzer division. And so we were constantly working, driving cattle around this place, and there'd be some great big 90-ton tank come crashing over the hill. Or there was one time where we drove a bunch of cattle straight into the middle of essentially a fake war that we didn't know was happening because there was all these soldiers on foot, but they were in camo, and they were doing a drill sneaking through the woods, and we were just trying to drive cattle to the next pasture. And we drove 500 head of mama cows right over top of these soldiers crouched down in the brush in camo with their rifles and everything. And we apologized to them, but that was a pretty regular occurrence. It was like you were in the middle of a fake war running cattle that whole time. And so I worked for them for 3 months. You get 90 days in they call it the Schigren area in Europe. And so I worked for them building fence and moving cattle and just learning how they do things in Sweden. And while I was there, I started looking, where could I possibly go in Africa? And I didn't know anybody in Africa. And so I put on a bunch of different Facebook groups for farmers in Africa. I made all these posts. I said, I'll work for free. All you got to do is feed me and give me a place to sleep. Just if anybody's got work, I just want to learn. And so during that time, I finally found one person. It was called, she runs a non-profit, I guess you'd call it, called Future Farmers, the Future Farmers Foundation. And what they do is they take young African kids that probably didn't have a lot of education and things growing up, and they live in rural areas, and they take them and they place them in these kind of assistant manager positions at big agriculture operations. So there was some people that went into rabbit production. There was some people that went into produce. There was people that went into cattle or sheep. And so I got in contact with them, and I ended up kind of, in a way, going as a mentor and working on a bunch of these cattle and sheep operations in South Africa. And while I was there, I would also sit down and talk with these kids that were learning how to manage large scale sheep and cattle operations, and we'd sit down and talk about the possibilities, where it could take you, things that worked, things that didn't work, but I was very lucky to find them because they had a huge network of ranches down there, and I got to bounce around between a bunch of them and just work with these essentially interns or assistant managers on these places. And so I learned a ton from them. The interesting thing about South Africa is that I wouldn't necessarily say they're scared of horses, but they're much more aware of how dangerous a horse can be, because there's no safety net in South Africa if you're badly injured. So if you're a man and you're in your 50s and you're working horseback there and you come off and break your leg, the healthcare, you probably can't afford healthcare. Maybe there's some free stuff down there, but if you end up crippled, there's no government programs paying your bills at that point. So to them, it was generally much too scary to think of the thought of getting hurt on a horse, and then potentially having to beg for money for the rest of their lives. So a lot of South African guys would rather walk than ride a horse, just to avoid the chance of getting badly injured on a horse. And that's not to say that nobody rode, because there's a small landlocked country inside of South Africa called Lesotho. And Lesotho is high up in the Drakensberg Mountains, and the reason why it's not part of South Africa is because when Shaka Zulu 500-600 years ago, whatever it was, he conquered essentially all of southern Africa, but he never could conquer those people because they had the high ground. They were at the tops of these cliffs in the Drakensberg Mountains, and so because they never could be conquered, when South Africa became its own country, they stayed sovereign. So it's a very small country, but horses are a huge part of their culture. So I worked with a lot of guys from Lesotho, and they were amazing horsemen. But generally, it seemed like they were the ones that were okay with riding horses, and the South African guys, the Zulus and the Sutus and some of these other kind of tribes that I worked with, they were less open to horses. They would rather just walk to get the job done. Those were the worst saddles I rode anywhere in the world. These African saddles were kind of pre-made. I wouldn't even know where you'd buy one of these things, because it was just an exposed tree that was really cheap fiberglass that would a lot of times have like little fiberglass hairs sticking out of it, and your stirrup leathers were just cheap, thin nylon, and the stirrups were those real small kind of bell English stirrups, and they just were. I expect those saddles probably costed $150 maybe to make. There was almost nothing to them, and so they were really uncomfortable. But to them, that's what they could afford. I mean, their saddle pads in Africa generally were dog food sacks that they would go. When they would shear sheep, they'd take all the spent wool or the junk wool that was too dirty to send off, and they would take that wool and pack it into these dog food sacks until they were somewhat soft, and then they'd put that on, and that was their saddle pad. So they were just getting by with what they had, but those were not nice saddles in Africa, and I wouldn't even know what to compare them to. They were probably the closest to an English saddle, but they were just a exposed fiberglass tree with nylon strings coming down to the stirrups, and I've got permanent scars on the insides of my calves from saddle sores, and not just from Africa and Mongolia and other places, but I've ridden so many bad saddles, and you kind of have to ride them differently. Your posture needs to change, and the way, like Argentinians, for example, the ones I worked with, rode really long stirrups, almost barely able to put pressure in them. And then in Australia, you rode kind of these stock saddles, which were an English saddle with a little bit more added to it. And so those stirrups were quite a bit shorter. So everywhere I went, people rode different, and I'd try and learn how they ride. But in the process, I would beat my body up pretty bad and get real bad saddle sores and things like that from trying to keep up with them. And so I've got these like $50 size scars on my legs from just wearing holes in them in different places, different countries.
How long did you stay in South Africa?
South Africa, the first time I was there for about 3 months, and then I ended up going back to the U.S., but then I went back to South Africa. So I spent 6 or 7 months there total, but it was 2 separate trips. But I really liked South Africa. I did a bunch of hunting down there as well. But after I left there, I came back to the U.S. and I was completely broke, and I just needed to make some money. So I went back to my grandpa's place and was I believe I was just haying for him and helping with the fall works and things like that. And I had about $2,000 in my bank account, and it was while I was in Sweden, I got 2 weeks leave, and I spent a week in Barcelona and a week in Rome, just being a tourist, seeing some of that stuff. And when I was in Rome, I stayed at this hostel that had like a basement nightclub underneath it. And I went down to this nightclub one night, and everybody's dancing, and a guy walks by, and he takes a feel of this girl standing right in front of me, and I knew nobody in this nightclub. And the guy standing next to me, it seemed he didn't know anybody else either, and we're just kind of standing there watching things happen. Well, this guy grabs this girl as he's going by and then walks off, and this girl turns around, and she thought it was the guy standing right next to me, so she takes her drink and throws it in his face and smacks him. And I started giggling because I had seen the whole thing happen, and he had done nothing wrong. He was just standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I started talking to him, and it turned out he was Mexican, and he was just traveling around Europe. And when he asked why I was in Europe, I told him about ranching all over the world, and he said, well, my dad owns a big ranch in Mexico if you're ever interested in coming to Mexico. So I got his contact information, and I never saw him again. But it was about a year later that I had worked the whole summer on my grandpa's place, and I was just getting itchy feet, and I thought, well, I should go check out Mexico. Now my Spanish is good. I feel a lot better about this. And so I went down to Chihuahua, and I worked for his family for 2 or 3 months down there. Knocked Mexico off my bucket list and saw some pretty wild things down there. And there's some really good cowboys down there in Mexico. There's not a lot of money down there in Chihuahua, so they don't have the nicest gear or anything, but man, could they make a nice horse. And those guys could rope, and I'd go help them put on these rodeos and stuff where the events were a little different than an American rodeo, but those guys, we see it up here in the States as, kind of a specialty act or something where they're jumping through the loops and back and forth. But these charros, they call them, those charros, they could front foot a horse and knock them down in their sleep. They were so good with those ropes, and they'd rope untouched horses. And they had this event where their rodeo arenas are perfectly round, and so they'd get a wild horse, and I can't remember if there was one or two guys horseback, and they'd get a wild horse in there, and one of the guys would be on the back of the horse, so they're riding double. And they get this wild horse running around the perimeter of this arena, and they run up right next to him on the inside with the saddle horse, the two guys riding double. And the guy on the back, at a dead gallop, will jump onto the wild horse and ride it until it doesn't feel like bucking anymore. Just really handy dudes down there. And so it was cool to see Mexico, but really I went there just because I had itchy feet and I wanted to see something different. But the point, at that point, I was trying to save money to go to Asia, because that was the last continent that I had to knock off my list. Yeah, Mongolia, I get asked a lot what was my favorite place, and it's a little hard. It's like asking a parent their favorite kid. They're all special in their own way, but Mongolia was really cool. That might have been my favorite place that I went to. And originally my plan in Mongolia was first I would just try to figure out where in Asia do they do anything even remotely cowboy. And the first place I started looking was Japan, because they raise all those Wagyu and Akaushi cattle and all those things. And I never really could find an inn in Japan. But then I saw these videos of these guys tripping down wild horses in Mongolia, just out on the steppe in the grass. And they'd trip down these horses and hop on them and just ride them until they quit bucking. And I thought that would be, I wonder if I could go over there. And so I started looking into it, and I found out horses are very cheap in Mongolia. Good broke horse is $500, maybe less. And so originally my plan was to go to Mongolia and buy a saddle horse and a pack horse, and just ride until I couldn't anymore, or was done. And on Instagram, I followed this guy that he was an American that had spent, he went over to Mongolia every summer, and I didn't really understand what he did or why he was there, but he was there. And I thought, well, this might be the only guy I could possibly ask advice from. And so I just sent him a message on Instagram, and he told me, he said, I'm happy to give you whatever advice you may need, but I'm putting together this trip, and I've built this network over here now where I can do it. And if you would like to go, I'm going to go live with the last people on Earth that still ride reindeer as their main source of transportation. And he said it's a hard journey to get out there, and so this isn't for everybody, but you've traveled and you clearly have some horse knowledge, and it's going to take quite a bit of riding to even get to these people. And he said, if you want to go, you got to pay your own way, but we're going to put together a crew and go up there and see these people. So I switched my plans a little bit, and I decided not to go buy horses, and I was going to go with him, because how could I pass up riding a reindeer in Mongolia? So I lined up all this stuff with him, and I flew over and met up with him, and we spent there's only one airport in Mongolia, one major airport, and it's in the capital of Ulaanbaatar. And prior to Mongolia being taken over by the Soviet Union, they were just all nomadic horse people. And the Soviet Union, when they were controlling them, they said, look, you guys can keep riding horses around and living in tents if you want, but we need to at least have a city where we can land planes, we can have meetings. We can't just be finding you guys horseback in the middle of nowhere all the time. So they built a city, Ulaanbaatar. So it's not a very old city, and I flew into Ulaanbaatar, met up with this guy, Eric, and we piled into these old Russian, they're like four-wheel drive vans, I guess. And there's not much for roads in Mongolia. There's paved roads in the capital, and then once you leave, it's all just 2-track. And Mongolia, there's no private land in Mongolia. It's all fair game. So you can set up your canvas teepee wherever you want to live, and nobody can tell you no as long as you're not harming anybody else. So there's no maintained roads. It's just these 2-tracks that go all over the country. And so we hop in these vans, and we drove for about 2 days just bouncing down 2 tracks until we get to a horse camp out in the middle of nowhere. And we rented some horses from this family, and they also guided us because they kind of knew where these reindeer folks were at. And we rode, I don't know, it was probably close to a week of us riding up into the mountains there, right on the Russian border. And we rode up there and they just told us, they said these people have no cell phones, no real contact with the outside world. When you find them, you're going to see them grazing reindeer first. So if you see these reindeer or caribou, whatever you want to call them, if you see them, let us know. And if we go find those reindeer, then we know the tribe is close by. So we just rode around in the mountains till we found reindeer. And then we met up with these people, and they just live in very primitive tents out there, or teepees. And there's no power, no refrigeration, nothing like that. So we rode in, and we lived with them for 2 or 3 weeks. And I would go out and help there was very distinct jobs for men and women and what they did every day. And so I went with the men, and we saddled up these caribou and went out and into the mountains and cut down several trees and bucked them into shorter logs. And then we packed a whole great big long string of reindeer full of logs for firewood. And we packed them up and packed them back down out of the mountains and restocked the whole camp with firewood on, I think that was the first day I was there, or day 2. I just learned how the wives would go out every morning and milk the female caribou that had young, and so they'd milk them into a pail, and they'd turn that into yogurt and cheese. They didn't have a lot of horses, those people, the reindeer people, but they milked horses a lot in Mongolia, and they made this stuff called arag. And arag was, because there's no refrigeration, the best way to preserve it is to ferment it. And so they would sew 2 goat skins together and leave a kind of a slice on the top where you could pour in more milk. And they had a culture in there that was, I think some of those cultures were hundreds of years old. And they'd pour that fresh mare's milk in there, and it would just sit in there and ferment with no refrigeration. And it would become slightly alcoholic. I think it was 5%. It was similar to beer. And everywhere you went, it was customary that they offer you a bowl of arag when you get there. And so anybody else I met over there that was a tourist or not from there got pretty sick from drinking that stuff. But I've got guts like a dog. I've never had food poisoning in my life, so I drank a whole bunch of that stuff, and I got to where I kind of liked it after a while. But the only herding they would do with the reindeer was just herding other reindeer. They'd have a herd of, that particular family might have had 500 or 600 reindeer, and so they'd have one they could ride, and they would just kind of keep them bunched up, and then they'd night pin them every night, because there was quite a bit of wolves up there in that country. And so they would take them out and graze them all day, and then they'd kind of round them up and bring them back by the teepees where they were close, and they'd put them in a corral overnight so they could watch them. And those people also had wolf dogs that lived with them, and those wolf dogs would kind of protect the home camp from the wild wolves.
Did they eat them, the reindeer?
Mm-hmm. They would, but I guess just somewhat recently, the Mongolian government realized that this was a dying culture, and it is. I think in my lifetime, these people may no longer exist because their numbers are dwindling, the people that still do this. And so the Mongolian government, in order to try and preserve that culture, they pay these families by the head for their reindeer. And so these families started to figure out that keeping the reindeer alive and collecting a check from the government was better for them than eating them. So they would still eat them, but it used to essentially be 100% of their diet, and now they're better off keeping them alive for the check and sending somebody on a horse down to buy a goat or something to eat instead. But their diets were only what they could produce, so they weren't going into town and buying things from the grocery store. So in the summertime, their diets were mainly dairy products, because that's what those animals produced at that time. And then also culturally, they talked a lot about how keeping or eating animals while there was still grass for them to be getting fatter was bad. So they would try to live off of just dairy in the summer and let those animals reproduce and grow and get fat. And then when wintertime would come around is when they would start eating a lot more meat, including their horses. So I worked for the reindeer, or lived with the reindeer people for a while, and then once we left, I ended up going and working for the outfitter that was supposed to sell me horses, with my original plan being to buy those horses. I said, I don't have the money to buy them anymore, but if you need help, I'm happy to help out. And so I got put to work with these guys that owned probably 600-700 horses. And I would just go find these horses every morning and bring them back and rope out the ones we needed for the day and things like that. But the horse people, which is 95% of their country, they'd ride horses every day. They'd milk the horses, but they would also eat the horses. And that was a big part of their diet, was horse meat. That was the summer of 2019 that I was over there. And I had every intention of going back again. And then COVID happened, and I had the flights bought and everything. And when COVID got to be pretty serious later in the year, they just refunded me my tickets and no more international travel as far as they were concerned at that point. So I never have made it back since then.
Did they have cattle or other livestock over there?
Yeah, they had, yaks were pretty prevalent over there, but they also had regular cattle. So what you would see a lot of times was I don't know what you would call that, but it was half cow, half yak. They were crossbred. So there was some straight yaks. There was some, somewhat normal looking European cattle over there, but for the most part, they were crossbred between yak and cattle. And then there was a lot of sheep. There's a lot of goats over there as well, and it's open range there. There's no fences in Mongolia, so it reminded me a lot of Wyoming or Montana 200-300 years ago before the wire went up, because you just kick your stock out and you gotta kind of keep an eye on it, but it just grazes all the time. So it's kind of interesting that the sheep and goats that they had over there was really no way to stick a brand on them. So they would every family had their own color paint, and they would paint their horns a certain color, and that's how they could keep them separate from the other herds out there on the range. I'd like to do a round two and go back and just pick a different country on every continent and do it again. I've sort of been putting that off because if I do it, I want to make sure this time when I do it, I would like to make a documentary about it when I do it, and that'll take a lot of planning and stuff. So and maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe I should just go do it and not be so worried about trying to make something out of it. But I have every intention of going. I'd really like to go see Nepal. They run yaks way up in the Himalayas there. I think that'd be cool. I'd love to see Brazil. They do some really cool stuff down there. Really cool cowboys down in Brazil. Spain is another. I've been to Spain, but I'd really like to see some of those ranches that they have. That old, they've got the fighting bulls. They've got the Andalusian horses, and they've got some really cool history of ranching in Spain. and in South Africa, both in Kenya and Zimbabwe and some of those places, there's a lot of cattle production in Africa. It's just a matter of figuring out how to get down there and get into that. So I'd love to go back to Africa and New Zealand too. Obviously, they've got huge ranches in New Zealand. So there's a lot of places still left to go to. I just haven't bought any of those flights yet.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank JB Zielke for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about JB at thelostcowboy.com. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons, Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, Scott Anderson, and Paige Marie Polis, for their support of this show. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.